Welcome to another episode of the SNC podcast. I am your host, Folashade Anozie. Before I get on with this episode, I want to take a moment to speak about the global health pandemic. The negative impact from the coronavirus disease is crushing and heartbreaking. My thoughts and prayers are also with the hundreds of thousands of people who are sick and have lost loved ones to COVID-19. Hopefully, a cure is found soon. I'm also thankful for all the health officials here in Nigeria and around the world who are doing their absolute best despite the circumstances. Please continue to stay safe. On this episode, I spoke with Oliver Enwonwu, a respected visual artist, brand strategist, art administrator, and curator based in Lagos, Nigeria. We spoke about the state of visual arts in Nigeria, the process behind art valuation, art forgery, and more. Oliver Enwonwu, welcome to the SNC podcast.
Thank you, Shadi.
Thank you so much for being here.
Happy to be.
I am excited about the conversation that we're going to be having today. But before we get knee deep into the conversation, let me introduce you.
Sure.
Good? So you are an artist, curator, art administrator, author, writer, publisher, and brand strategist. You're also the founder, executive director, and trustee of the Ben Enwonwu Foundation. In addition, you are the president of the Society of Nigerian Artists, director of Omenka Gallery, and CEO of Revelo. Did I get that right?
Revelo.
Revelo Company Limited. You sit on the boards of various organizations, including the Reproduction Rights Society of Nigeria and the Lagos Biennial. How do you pronounce that? Biennial?
Correct.
Biennial. Okay. And I would be remiss if I didn't add that your father was the late celebrated Nigerian creative artist, Professor Benedict Chukwukadibia Enwonwu.
Good try.
What was up about that?
Enwonwu.
Enwonwu.
Yes, Enwonwu. That's how I pronounce his surname.
Okay, Chukwukadibia Enwonwu.
Yes.
Okay. So what was it like growing up with a father like yours? And how did that, if it did, affect how you perceive and appreciate the arts?
Well, it was very interesting now that I think about it in retrospect, because it's very easy for an artist's son to imbibe some of his father's leanings. I mean, I grew up smelling paint around the house. I saw him sculpt, so this made a very strong impression on me as a child. And while growing up, he was very happy to observe that I had talent, and it was very encouraging. While I was at King's College, I knew that he helped me cheat on a couple of assignments, art assignments, and he was very proud that I won prizes while at St. Saviour's, even at primary school. Mm-hmm. So he was a very encouraging father, very supportive, and he always wanted, his children to always be busy. He couldn't stand anyone who wasn't doing anything at a particular time. He always wanted you to be busy, and he always believed in excellence. So he believed in whatever you do, you make sure that you do it to the best of your ability. So that was very important, and these were lessons that we grew up learning.
Great. And was he the kind of father that said, okay, it's great that you have this artistic or creative background, but I still want you to go to school and become a doctor? Or he was supportive of the fact that if you want to pursue this professionally, go ahead and do that?
Well, he always wanted his kids to pursue the academics, very important. But I was his youngest son, or I am his youngest son, and he wanted his youngest son to be a priest.
Wow.
I turned out wrong. Yes. So I was supposed to be the one dedicated.
Yeah.
Yes.
Wow. So you were like, so were you like, I'm sorry.
What a priest I would have
I
turned
know,
out.
right? When I was young, I wanted to become a nun because of Sound of Music.
So we share something
I
in
know.
common.
And then I realized that the life that I live, I would be kicked out of the convent.
There's no doubt about it. Same here. So we share a lot in common.
Yeah, right.
Very refreshing to
I know. So what about your mom? What was she also supportive of you?
My mother was supportive, but as far as I can remember, she always wanted me to be a doctor. Yes, I was supposed to be a neurosurgeon.
Wow.
But that turned out wrong as well.
Why did she want to become a neurosurgeon?
Well, because in her own time, she wanted to be a doctor herself.
Oh, I see.
So she was kind of living her dreams through me.
Through you. Okay. But and before I move on, I should note that you graduated from the University of Lagos, Nigeria, where you earned a degree in biochemistry, an advanced diploma in exploration geophysics with the distinction, and a postgraduate diploma in applied geophysics and visual arts, also with the distinction. And you also hold the distinction as the best graduating master's in art history student from Unilag. Now, I'm going to start off asking, why do you think that a lot of Nigerians are afraid to talk about death?
Well, that's a very complex question.
Okay.
But I think that a lot of people, especially Nigerians, we grow up with family. Family around us. We have lots of shared relationships, a lot of shared ambitions. So no one ever really feels he's had enough time to achieve or accomplish these things that he set out for himself or herself. And a lot of people still feel very attached to their loved ones. I think Nigerians, by virtue of who they are, they're very full of life. I mean, think about Lagos with all this chaos and the hustle and bustle of Lagos. People enjoy that. So no one wants to just leave that behind, just like that. So in as much as we're a very religious country, and on every street you see a church or two, but I think Nigerians still are very full of zest and life.
Yeah, but do you think that in addition to being full of life and zest and all these things that we want to accomplish, it is still important that we have conversations regarding the fact that tomorrow anybody can die, and we need to have proper plans in place on what will happen when that person passes on?
Oh, I agree with you. It's very important to have plans in place. I think that our corporate sector, they scream about this almost every day. With pensions, they scream about it with what happens with the afterlife. And even we artists are beginning to think, because a number of us, have passed away without leaving proper plans in place for successive generations. So I think it's very important planning your estate, when you pass away. It's very important.
Yeah.
An artist knowing that your works become ambassadors even after you've passed on. So what happens to these works? How are they cared for? How are they kept for the next generation? What happens to your history or your contributions to art, in your own local country and even internationally? These are conversations that artists are beginning to have and collectors are beginning to have. What happens to their collections after?
Yeah, because I asked that question because it goes to part of the conversation we're going to be having today, which is you're the heir of a famous creative, and you lost your father in 1994, right? Yes. Did your father have conversations regarding having an estate plan? Yes. And did he also talk about what he wanted to happen while he was still alive and after he died?
Absolutely. He always spoke of giving 5 of his works to the federal government of Nigeria, while the rest, were for our education, to make sure that each child is educated to the best of their ability. So that was very important for him. So 5 to the federal government, the rest were to be given to my mother, and to make sure that she trades, exhibits, and gains her sustenance from that for herself and for her children.
Okay, so before he died, he had taken some legal and business steps in putting down.
He had a will.
Oh, he had a will.
Yes,
okay, great. Okay, so your father is not here for me to ask him all these questions. I was just thinking about how he went about choosing an executor. Just when we think about putting together an estate plan, there are certain steps people have to take in order for the estate plan to actually function properly. And I just wanted to talk about that. After your father died, you and your siblings, what was going through your mind in terms of keeping your father's legacy at the forefront of Nigerian culture, Nigerian art culture? Because it's one thing for your father to say he wants to have 5 pieces of art go to the government and the rest to your mother. But you as children, what was going through your minds in order to secure his legacy?
Well, it was very important for us because when he passed away, even in his lifetime, we had people coming over to do their research on him. We know a lot of artists on those in academia today who have gained their PhDs just on research work on him. So it's very important for us to put all of this together. My mom busied herself with making sure that his written manuscripts were properly typed. She spent a lot of hours, making sure that was put together. So my siblings and I sat down and we thought about the best way to preserve his legacy in a structured format. And then we thought about the foundation. And because I'm an artist and I was the one in the art, they all decided to support me in making sure that we have this foundation that is established to preserve his legacy. And the foundation was established in 2003, and through exhibitions, debates, residencies, we try as much as possible, to preserve his legacy. Now we're working on the catalogue raisonné, which is a compendium of all his known pieces, because we're trying to stem the spate of forgeries that are, of course, when an artist begins to appreciate and value, you have unscrupulous people who want to make quick money from it. So that has been, one of the one of our approaches to ensure that we preserve his legacy. And preserving his legacy also means even merchandise, anything within his image, and we even have the international community of academics, who write every now and then, those who are doing books, who want images of his work. So we're busy with that. And we're also planning more exhibitions both on the local and international scene. Okay. Just a couple of years ago, the Tate in the UK had an exhibition, with him, at the forefront, talking about Nigerian modernism in art. So, of course, we're very happy to also work with these institutions in preserving and promoting his legacy.
Now, you touched on something about forgeries. How does... So, backtrack, a catalogue raisonné, is that how to pronounce it? What is that exactly?
It's a compendium of all his known works.
Got it.
Verified and authenticated.
Okay. I think it's just important that we always break these terms down. Not everybody know go to school.
Oh, you did?
Now, we talked about forgeries, right?
Yes.
How does that affect the standing of an artist's work? Because people may just say, well, it's a forgery. Anybody would know what an original Ben Enwonwu work is. Yes. But obviously, I feel like you have a different perspective on how forgeries affects your father's work, right?
Yes.
Okay, let's talk about that.
Well, forgeries affect my father's work and every other artist in the sense that it causes a depreciation of his works. You have works that are done by artists that are not as strong, so it weakens, with the general perspective, when people see a forgery that is extremely poor, then you judge the artist based on that, and then collectors, the whole beauty about art is the exclusiveness of the art of a piece. When an artist's piece is created in multiples, then each multiple becomes smaller in value. So you can imagine a collector having a piece where there are 5 of those, then it's not as valuable as the proper piece.
Got it.
So in many ways it affects the value of an artist's work and his oeuvre.
What is that, Uber?
It's his body of work.
Got it. Okay, yes. Great. Now I want to move on to the work that you do.
Yes.
Like I mentioned in the beginning of our conversation, you are a well-rounded creative and a businessman.
Thank you.
For example, you have exhibited your works across several countries, including Nigeria, the United Kingdom, United States, Ireland, and South Africa at the Joburg Art Fair. Your works also form part of many significant private and public government collections, including the Bank of Industry, the Delta State Government, and so many others. Now, for someone who wants to become an artist or is an artist and wants his or her work to become part of these types of collections, can you talk about the process of how that happens? Let's start off first with how you go about having an exhibition. What does that even mean to have an exhibition as an artist?
Well, for me, an exhibition is about displaying your works, introducing your work, to the public space, to collectors, to critics, so that so usually you have something to say. An exhibition also serves purposes of sales, so you can make money from it for your sustenance and to continue on pursuing your career. So for me, that's the two-pronged approach to having an exhibition. Now, how do you go about having an exhibition?
Before you go, okay, that's,
All right. I think that you start by creating your own philosophy because not many spaces would want to show your work if you're not, if you haven't reached a point where you have defined your philosophy. So you need to get to a point where, you are viewed upon as a serious artist, because, most of the spaces are galleries, and these galleries have already been in business for a while. So they want an artist who has a defined philosophy. So he knows what he's doing, he's aware of his techniques, he's not just experimenting, But the easiest way to start is probably through group exhibitions where you and maybe other artists of your ilk, show together. So you can enter into group shows, you can have joint shows, and then for me, the peak of having an exhibition is when you have a solo show, which means that you are now ready. You're no longer experimenting, but you have something to say, about your work. Of course, it is true that artists will go on trying to strive to achieve perfection all through their careers, but you must get to some appreciable points, where you can have shows. So they shouldn't be so regular, but for me, these are the processes. Now, these days, there are alternative spaces where you can have, exhibitions, but the purists still believe that it should be a proper gallery space, or you can have a museum show, so I think essentially these are the ways, but you must get into the public space. For me, that's, you must gain some sort of public acceptance, and that for me shows, how relevant your work will be.
Would you consider yourself a purist?
Yes and no. Yes and no, but that for me is the beauty of art, because I think it's the only profession where, it's actually living, in the sense that there's an art to speaking, there's an art to wearing clothes, an art to working, and walking as well. But let's go back to art, and art can be viewed as a functional piece, where you can even sit on it, or even as cooking utensils, and then you can actually have fine art, which, are for appreciation purposes, aesthetic value. Then you can also have art for religious purposes. There's so many varying functions of art that, and people have even been known to have investment-worthy art. So it's even a store of value as well. So for me, it's so broad-based that it's difficult to box art into, a framework, for instance. And I think that, having said that, you have art that exists in galleries. Well, you have art that is in public space. For instance, statues of Mandela, for instance, a public space, and remind people of how great this man has been in his lifetime, and his contributions to society at large. And then you have art that resonates in the public space, whereby they're used to embellish public buildings and spaces, so people can connect, for whatever reason. And these days, artists in public spaces, judging from the international museums, where people even pay entry fees, to go see art. And these days with technology, you can even immerse yourself in a room, and that room itself constitutes the art.
Yeah.
So things have changed. Boundaries are being blurred every day. So I think that art is all embracing and so encompassing now that it's no longer tenable for anyone to say that art is elitist.
So as an artist,
Yes.
how do you decide what price that you're going to allocate to your works?
Well, I think, let me speak broadly first about how value is attributed to a piece. First of all, you must consider the artist's contributions to the local narrative, historical art narrative in his own community, perhaps his country, and then internationally, what have been his contributions to global narratives. What schools has the artist attended? The more prestigious the schools are, there's more the likelihood that his value for his work will be higher. Where has he exhibited in his lifetime? Very important. And also, who has bought his work? Such elements, even factors like that affect, for instance, if a very famous person like Michael Jackson, has bought a piece, even if it's the same work, of similar size, similar year, similar theme by the same artist, is more likely that piece will cost more. So these things are extremely important. And of course, even within the mediums, there's a hierarchy. For instance, sculpture and painting cost. More traditional mediums, for instance, might cost even more than the drawings, because drawings, until fairly recently, were just means of conceptualizing what you are going to produce. they weren't viewed as a finished work in itself. So, and then painting with oils, for instance, might fetch considerably more than painting with pastels or watercolor, because oil, for instance, is not only a traditional medium, but, has been known to last even longer than watercolor that is susceptible to ultraviolet light, Yes, so I think, broadly speaking, now, how does an artist price his pieces? There's also peer review. What do your mates say about you? What do the critics say about your work? These are very important things to consider when pricing your work.
So if an upcoming artist, or not even upcoming, let's say I become a painter.
Yes.
You mentioned all these different things. So, for example, you went to a prestigious school and I went to a non-prestigious school.
Yes.
So the way you're going to price your work is you can give it a higher price because of the schools you've gone to compared to my schools. Wow.
Yes, because that sometimes if you work with the gallery helps to set your prices.
Yeah.
So ultimately, the galleries or your manager or your agent, sets the prices based on the market. You're only as good as what the market will offer or pay for your work.
Okay.
So that is a very nice way of even settling things very easily.
Now, what is the best way to preserve artworks?
Okay.
So, like, for example, the ones we have in your gallery now, what's the best way to preserve them?
Well, the best way to preserve art, the very mundane level, is to make sure there's the humidity, is right. You don't have your works very close to where there's a high content of moisture. Make sure, for instance, that your watercolors are not exposed to UV light, so you must face them away from sunlight. You must have the right lighting, on them, so that's not destructive to them. For instance, in a gallery like this, be careful about those who come in. They don't touch the pieces, especially with photography. If it's not glassed, for instance, you don't want the acid in your hands to affect it later on. You must make sure children, are not even allowed here to run around. If you're having an exhibition opening, for instance, even little things like people carrying wine glasses, they shouldn't come in because there's a tendency or you're at risk of wine spilling on the works and damaging the pieces.
Got it.
So these little rules are extremely important. And how your work is framed is very important as well. If for instance, if you frame and the glass is touching the frame, for instance, there's a tendency that in a humid environment, it will later on attach itself.
Just to the glass. So there has to be enough space.
Yes. And even for artists, you must work even from the outset with the right materials that would last. You should make sure that you use acid-free paper, because later on, you're going to have brown patches or spots, maybe the next 30 years on your pieces. So these are things you must take into consideration.
So you have 13 years experience and expertise from running a leading gallery in Africa, which is Omenka Gallery. Can you talk a bit about what makes Omenka Gallery unique?
Well, there are many things. I like that question. It's a very interesting question because even the name Omenka has a meaning.
What does it mean?
It means, in Igbo land where I'm from, it means someone who's creative. And it's a word I derived from my father's manuscripts. Because when he passed away, I was going through some of his things. We spoke of that earlier when I sat down with my siblings to decide on what better structure and what's the best way to preserve his legacy. And we were going through his scripts, and I noticed that he was always going to have a gallery in his lifetime, which he never accomplished, and he was going to call it Omenka. So I said to myself, well, if I ever have a gallery, it will be in fulfillment of his dream. Now, why is Omenka unique? Omenka is unique because the artists that we represent, have their own philosophy. It's very important. So we're very focused on representing artists, whose work resonates with the African continent, because we believe in telling our own story. It's very important. Art history, especially in Africa, has been written by the West. So I think it's about time we told our own story and presented facts the way, they've actually occurred. Now, we also represent not only Nigerian artists, we've got a Cameroonian artist, and we've got an American artist who's based in South Africa. But the key thing, about the artists we work with is that their works or the themes resonate with the African continent. So that's very important for us. Omenka is unique because we not only represent artists here, and not only are we interested in showing their works here, but we've been to art fairs on about 5 continents, showcasing at some of the most prestigious international art fairs like the Armory, like Art Dubai, like Cape Town Art Fair and Joburg Art Fair. So it's very important for us to, expose the artists as much as possible to broader audiences.
What opinion do you have on the state of visual artists and arts in Nigeria?
Well, I think that it's on the rise. I mean, you can't compare the state where we are now with 20 years ago. I mean, judging by the galleries, which are more professionally run, judging by the more exquisite catalogs, containing critical text, when you also consider that there's a secondary market now, we've got 2 or 3 major auction houses that are doing extremely well and establishing the prices for Nigerian art and artists. When you also look at the fact that we have international events like the Lagos Biennale, an Artex, and auction houses like Art House Contemporary. I think these are very important factors. I mean, just the other day, the Embassy Shillong Museum was birthed, so you can see that there's a structure now beginning to form, and that structure is extremely important. What we need now is public and private sector partnerships, the funding, how identifying the value chain, making sure there's government support, in creating, a level playing field, or to make sure that regulations, are in place. For instance, we don't have a national gallery of art, just like you'd have maybe the British Museum, for instance, where you can see the heritage of a people, and I think that's extremely important, in understanding ourselves better, as a people, and showing peaceful coexistence and tolerance. These things are very important. Now, as a government, helping to encourage the private sector, for instance, to ensure that maybe through tax rebates, to ensure that they support artists and, do some serious policies towards the arts. The government has come up with the CIFI initiative, with the central bank. But when you look at it, there isn't anything for the visual artist. There's technology, there's fashion, there's entertainment, but the visual artists have been left out. Now, Alliance Francaise, there's a building just down the road, and it's been donated by a very successful businessman, Mike Adenuga, and yet we have parking issues, because when you have major events there, the government has not been very forthcoming in supporting the visual arts, for instance, and then you have a businessman, a local businessman, who has put his own personal wealth, in ensuring that Lagos sits on the map, and you have cars being towed away. Now, I know that space, for instance, that is outside where the cars are being towed away, is problematic in the sense that cars shouldn't park there. But you can come to an agreement with the owners of the building and the French Cultural Center to find out how best, because whatever is being done in that place projects Lagos, projects the art and culture of the people. And if we say that we're trying to diversify away from oil, how is it that this institution has not been called into a dialogue, for instance? So these are ways that the government, can play a very important role in ensuring that our culture is propagated, our culture is preserved and promoted. Very important.
Yeah. Using your father as a reference point,
Yes.
and looking at how much you have achieved yourself,
Thank you.
what advice would you give to visual artists who are trying to not only achieve financial success, but also want to have longevity with their careers?
Well, I think that you must not rest on your oars. Having temporary or fleeting success doesn't mean you've arrived yet. And any great artist or any person who's achieved anything, in life, has always not rested. You continue to strive to achieve perfection and excellence, because the boundaries of knowledge you can only push forward, by little bit. All those have come before you, and you must, achieve something to show that you're counted. What impact do you have in your generation? What have you left? Whose life have you changed? But I think by far the most important piece of advice I'll give anyone, especially a black person, is constantly read. Just devour everything that you have in sight, because it affects you, and it makes you. Knowledge is power. There's this saying that if you want to hide anything from a black man, put it in a book. It broadens your mind. You can travel in a book. You can speak better in a book. You can improve yourself in a book. And there's so much information out there that is really in commonplace, but you'll never find it if you don't read. So for me, that's any advice. You want longevity, reinvent yourself. The only way you can do that is by reading.
Yeah.
Information is power. Yes.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Oliver.
Thank you, Shadi.
This episode is produced and edited by me, Folashade Anozie. Theme song for the show is by Imodu Ayonote. The podcast is available on AudioMac, Podbean, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and Stitcher Radio. Simply search for the SNC Podcast, which is one